Spring 1945. Berlin no longer resembled the proud capital that had once projected the power of a rising European empire. Entire districts had been reduced to shattered brick and twisted steel. Smoke drifted endlessly above the city, while the thunder of artillery echoed from every direction. Streets that had once carried military parades were now filled with refugees, wounded soldiers, and exhausted civilians searching desperately for food and shelter. Day and night, the explosions grew closer. Every hour brought new reports of bridges destroyed, defensive lines overrun, and entire formations disappearing from military maps. Deep beneath the ruins, inside reinforced concrete bunkers, officers continued moving colored markers across giant maps of Europe. Yet those maps no longer reflected reality. The armies they represented were shrinking faster than new orders could be written. Just 6 years earlier, few people could have imagined such an ending. In 1939, Germany possessed one of the most modern armies in the world. Its soldiers were highly trained, its commanders had developed innovative operational doctrines, and its industries had been transformed to support rapid rearmament. Across Europe, military observers watched in astonishment as campaign after campaign ended with astonishing speed. Many believed they were witnessing a revolution in warfare. Yet by May 1945, Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Millions of lives had been lost. Cities lay in ruins across Europe and Asia, and the most destructive conflict in human history had finally come to an end. The question has challenged historians ever since. How did Germany, after achieving some of the most dramatic military victories of the 20th century, ultimately lose the Second World War? The answer cannot be found in a single battle, one failed campaign, or one decisive moment. Instead, Germany's defeat emerged through a chain of strategic decisions. Some appeared brilliant when they were made. Others seemed necessary under the circumstances. But together they stretched resources, expanded the war beyond sustainable limits, and gradually shifted the balance toward an increasingly powerful coalition of enemies. Each decision narrowed Germany's options. Each strengthened the Allies. Each brought the war one step closer to its final outcome. To understand that story, we must first return to the beginning. On the morning of September 1st, 1939, German forces crossed the Polish frontier. Columns of armored vehicles advanced behind waves of aircraft, while artillery battered defensive positions. Motorized infantry followed closely behind, exploiting breakthroughs before defenders could reorganize. Rather than fighting slow, attritional battles like those of the First World War, Germany relied on speed, coordination, and surprise. Within weeks, Poland had been defeated. The campaign shocked military planners across the world. Although historians continue to debate the popular use of the word blitzkrieg, there was little doubt that Germany had demonstrated an extraordinarily effective way of combining armor, air power, communications, and maneuver. The victories continued. Denmark fell quickly. Norway followed after a difficult but ultimately successful campaign. Then came the offensive in Western Europe. In May 1940, German armor formations pushed through the Ardennes, a region many Allied planners considered unsuitable for a major attack. Instead of striking where the strongest defenses waited, German commanders concentrated speed and surprise where resistance was weakest. The result was operational chaos for the defending forces. Within 6 weeks, France had fallen. The victory stunned the world. One of Europe's strongest military powers had been defeated with astonishing speed. Millions watched as German troops marched through Paris. Across occupied Europe, governments collapsed or fled into exile. Britain suddenly found itself standing largely alone in Western Europe. To many observers, German victory appeared almost inevitable. Its armies had demonstrated remarkable professionalism. Its commanders coordinated aircraft, artillery, engineers, and armor formations with impressive efficiency. Confidence spread not only among military leaders but throughout much of German society. Yet beneath those spectacular victories, serious weaknesses already existed. Germany possessed an outstanding army, but it did not possess unlimited resources. Oil remained scarce. Rubber had to be imported or manufactured synthetically. Certain strategic metals were limited. The economy was strong enough for rapid campaigns, but would face increasing strain in a prolonged global conflict. These problems remained hidden while victories came quickly. Every successful campaign reinforced a dangerous belief that bold offensives could solve almost any strategic challenge. Confidence became certainty. Certainty slowly became overconfidence. Meanwhile, Germany's future opponents were learning valuable lessons. Britain strengthened its air defenses and expanded its industrial production. The Soviet Union accelerated military modernization while relocating critical industries farther east, beyond the reach of potential invasion. Across the Atlantic, the United States possessed an industrial capacity unlike anything the world had ever seen. Although not yet fully committed to the war, American factories had the potential to produce aircraft, ships, tanks, trucks, ammunition, and fuel on a scale few governments truly appreciated. Time itself was becoming a strategic weapon. Every month that passed without a decisive German victory allowed Allied production to grow, new armies to form, and military experience to accumulate. Wars are rarely won by battlefield brilliance alone. They are won through logistics, industry, intelligence, leadership, and the ability to replace losses over time. As the conflict expanded, these factors would become increasingly important. Germany's soldiers continued to achieve remarkable tactical successes, but maintaining those successes across an ever-growing battlefield would prove far more difficult. Stretching from the Atlantic coast to Eastern Europe, supply lines grew longer. Rail networks required constant repair. Fuel consumption increased dramatically. Every captured territory demanded occupation forces. Every new campaign consumed trained soldiers, experienced officers, and valuable equipment that could not always be replaced quickly. The deeper Germany advanced into Europe, the greater the burden became. At the same time, Allied cooperation steadily improved. British intelligence broke important enemy communications. American factories accelerated production. Soviet military planning evolved after painful early defeats. Each Allied nation possessed different strengths, but together they formed a coalition with enormous military, industrial, and economic potential. Germany, by contrast, increasingly found itself fighting opponents whose combined resources far exceeded its own. Yet none of this guaranteed Germany's defeat. History is shaped by choices. Some decisions create opportunities. Others create consequences that cannot easily be reversed. In the years ahead, Germany's leadership would repeatedly face moments where strategic judgment mattered more than battlefield courage. Some choices were driven by optimism, others by urgency, still others by the belief that one final offensive could restore the initiative. Instead, each decision gradually narrowed Germany's path to victory. The first would open the largest land campaign in history, a campaign stretching thousands of kilometers across forests, rivers, cities, and open plains. It promised a swift victory, but it would instead become the beginning of a struggle that transformed the entire course of the war. As hundreds of thousands of vehicles assembled along the eastern frontier during the summer of 1941, few could imagine that the decisions made in the coming months would echo across generations. The road to Berlin did not begin in the ruins of 1945. It began with choices made years earlier, when confidence was at its highest and victory appeared within reach on the morning of June 22, 1941. The silence along Europe's eastern frontier vanished beneath the roar of thousands of artillery guns. Across a front stretching nearly 2,900 kilometers, Axis forces crossed into the Soviet Union in what remains the largest land invasion in military history. More than 3 million Axis soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, aircraft, trucks, and horse-drawn supply wagons, advanced in 3 massive army groups. To the north lay Leningrad. At the center stood Moscow, the Soviet capital. In the south stretched the fertile fields and industrial regions of Ukraine. German planners believed that if these objectives fell quickly, organized Soviet resistance would collapse. The campaign was built upon one critical assumption: the war in the east would be won before winter arrived. That assumption shaped nearly every aspect of the operation. Supply planners calculated fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts for a campaign expected to last only a few months. Winter, clothing was given little priority. Vehicle maintenance schedules reflected rapid movement rather than prolonged fighting across enormous distances. German commanders anticipated decisive encirclement battles similar to those fought in Poland and France. At first, events seemed to confirm those expectations. German armored spearheads broke through Soviet border defenses with remarkable speed. Entire Soviet formations found themselves surrounded before many commanders fully understood the scale of the invasion. Luftwaffe aircraft struck airfields across the frontier, destroying hundreds of Soviet aircraft on the ground during the opening days. Roads became clogged with retreating troops, abandoned vehicles, and columns of civilians fleeing the fighting. Within weeks, German forces captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners in enormous encirclement battles around Minsk and Smolensk. To many observers, the campaign appeared to be unfolding exactly as German planners had predicted. Yet beneath these spectacular victories, warning signs were already emerging. The Soviet Union proved vastly larger than previous opponents. Every kilometer gained lengthened supply lines. Railways had to be converted to different track gauges before trains could deliver ammunition and fuel. Trucks endured punishing journeys across rough roads, while horses, still responsible for moving much of the army's equipment, became exhausted by the relentless pace. Distance itself became an enemy. A tank that outran its fuel supply was no longer an effective weapon. An artillery battery without ammunition became silent. Every advance demanded more transport, more maintenance, and more time. Meanwhile, the Soviet state did not collapse. Although the opening weeks were catastrophic, Soviet authorities mobilized millions of additional soldiers, while industries began relocating east of the Ural Mountains. Entire factories were dismantled, transported by rail, and rebuilt far beyond the reach of German bombers. Workers resumed production under extraordinary conditions, ensuring that tanks, aircraft, and artillery continued reaching the front despite the invasion. German intelligence had underestimated both the size of the Soviet Union's reserves and its capacity to recover. As summer turned toward autumn, German commanders faced increasingly difficult choices. Should the main effort continue toward Moscow, or should forces be diverted to secure Ukraine and the northern approaches? The debate reflected a broader strategic dilemma, whether to pursue political, economic, or military objectives first. These decisions consumed valuable time. Every delay allowed Soviet forces to strengthen defensive positions around the capital. By October, German formations launched Operation Typhoon, the offensive toward Moscow. Initial progress was impressive, but autumn rain transformed roads into deep mud. Vehicles bogged down. Supply convoys slowed to a crawl. Even horses struggled through the thick, waterlogged ground. Then came winter. Temperatures plunged far below freezing. Lubricants thickened inside engines. Weapons required constant maintenance to remain operational. Frostbite became a serious threat to soldiers who lacked adequate winter clothing. Repair crews worked tirelessly to keep vehicles moving despite conditions for which many had never been prepared. The Soviet defenders, reinforced by fresh formations transferred from Siberia, counterattacked in early December. These troops arrived equipped and trained for severe winter conditions, adding strength to a defense that Germany had expected to collapse months earlier. The advance on Moscow stalled. The opportunity for a quick victory had vanished. The consequences reached far beyond the battlefield. Instead of a short campaign, Germany now faced a prolonged war of attrition against an opponent with enormous manpower, expanding industrial production, and growing experience. Every tank destroyed would need replacement. Every train crew lost would require months to rebuild. Every kilometer gained would demand additional supplies simply to hold existing positions. For ordinary soldiers, the strategic consequences were measured in daily hardship. Infantrymen dug frozen defensive positions under relentless shell fire. Mechanics struggled to repair engines in temperatures that froze tools to bare hands. Medical teams treated frostbite alongside combat wounds, while supply units fought to deliver food, fuel, and ammunition across increasingly difficult routes. The campaign had become something entirely different from what had been planned. Rather than delivering a decisive victory, Operation Barbarossa committed Germany to a vast conflict stretching across forests, rivers, cities, and open plains. The Eastern Front would consume enormous quantities of men and equipment for the remainder of the war, becoming the largest and most destructive theater of the conflict. The first strategic decision had transformed the war itself. Germany had achieved remarkable tactical successes during the opening months, but it failed to secure the rapid political and military collapse on which the entire operation depended. From this point forward, Germany would be forced to fight a long war against an adversary capable of replacing losses on an immense scale. And while fierce fighting continued across the Eastern Front, another decision was about to widen the conflict even further. Within months, Germany would find itself confronting not only the Soviet Union and the British Empire, but also the world's greatest industrial power, a development that would reshape the balance of the war. AS German forces struggled against mounting resistance on the Eastern Front. Events thousands of kilometers away were about to transform the war into a truly global conflict. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Within hours, the United States declared war on Japan. 4 days later, on December 11th, Germany declared war on the United States. From a military perspective, the decision dramatically altered Germany's strategic situation. Until that moment, the United States had been supplying Britain and the Soviet Union through programs such as Lend-Lease, providing trucks, locomotives, food, raw materials, and military equipment without being a direct combatant against Germany. Once war was declared, America's enormous industrial and military capacity could now be directed openly toward defeating Germany. At first, the full consequences were not immediately visible. The German army was still fighting deep inside Soviet territory. U-boats continued operating in the Atlantic. North Africa remained fiercely contested. Yet behind the front lines, a new contest was already underway. One fought not only by soldiers, but by engineers, factory workers, shipbuilders, and scientists. Factories across the United States expanded at an extraordinary pace. Civilian automobile plants were converted into tank and truck factories. Shipyards launched cargo vessels faster than German submarines could sink them. Aircraft production increased month after month, supplying not only American forces, but also allied nations across multiple theaters of war. By 1944, American industry had reached a scale unmatched in modern history. Thousands of aircraft, tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and merchant ships rolled off production lines in staggering numbers. Fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, and spare parts flowed across oceans, sustaining Allied operations from Britain to the Soviet Union. For Germany, this presented a challenge that battlefield victories alone could not solve. Even successful operations became increasingly difficult to exploit because the Allies could replace equipment and personnel at a far greater rate. Every destroyed Allied aircraft could eventually be replaced. Every damaged ship could often be repaired or substituted. Every offensive was supported by an industrial base that continued to expand despite the war. The Atlantic became one of the conflict's most critical battlegrounds. German U-boats attempted to sever the shipping routes connecting North America with Britain. If these convoys could be destroyed, Britain might be isolated and deprived of supplies needed to continue the war. Initially, submarine operations achieved significant success. Merchant ships disappeared beneath the Atlantic waves, while convoy escorts struggled against an elusive enemy operating beneath the surface. But the balance gradually shifted. Improved radar, sonar, long-range patrol aircraft, escort carriers, and increasingly sophisticated code-breaking allowed Allied naval forces to locate and destroy growing numbers of German submarines. The Battle of the Atlantic slowly turned against Germany. Meanwhile, the air war intensified. American heavy bombers joined British bombing campaigns against German industrial centers, transportation networks, oil facilities, and aircraft factories. By day and by night, waves of bombers crossed occupied Europe under fighter escort, forcing Germany to divert thousands of anti-aircraft guns, fighter aircraft, and experienced pilots away from the front lines. Every fighter defending the skies over Germany was one less available over the Eastern Front. Every railway damage delayed supplies reaching combat units. Every destroyed refinery reduced precious fuel reserves. The war had become a struggle of endurance. German engineers continued designing advanced weapons, including improved tanks and jet aircraft, but technological innovation alone could not overcome the growing imbalance in production. New equipment often arrived too late, in too few numbers, or without sufficient fuel, spare parts, and trained crews to change the course of the conflict. For ordinary civilians, the expanding war brought increasing hardship. Air raid sirens became a daily reality in many German cities. Families sought shelter beneath streets and public buildings as bombers passed overhead. Factory workers returned to damaged production lines after attacks, attempting to restore output while shortages of raw materials and electricity became increasingly severe. On the front lines, soldiers noticed a change as well. American-built trucks carried Soviet supplies. British and American aircraft challenged German control of the skies. Fresh Allied equipment appeared in growing quantities across multiple theaters. The conflict was no longer being fought against isolated opponents. Germany now faced a coalition whose combined industrial, economic, and military resources exceeded its own by a wide margin. Yet even under these increasingly difficult circumstances, Germany still possessed experienced commanders, disciplined soldiers, and formidable fighting formations. Defeat was not yet inevitable. The greater danger lay elsewhere. As the war expanded, strategic decisions became more complex, requiring careful coordination between military operations, logistics, industrial production, and diplomacy. Success depended not only on battlefield leadership, but also on effective command at the highest level. Instead of increasing flexibility, however, Germany's decision-making became increasingly centralized. Senior commanders found their operational freedom narrowing as strategic direction flowed more directly from the top. The consequences of that shift would soon become painfully clear on battlefields where timing, adaptability, and local judgment often meant the difference between survival and destruction. The next turning point in Germany's road to defeat would not begin with a new weapon or a foreign invasion. It would begin inside the command rooms where critical military decisions were made, decisions that increasingly ignored the realities unfolding at the front.